In 2020, Chadwick Boseman passed away, and both Marvel and Ryan Coogler had the impossible task of making a sequel without their main star. Is this a better movie than its predecessor, or did it fail without its king? We're about to find out. Let the battle commence. The story for Black Panther is that T'Challa returns to Wakanda to take his father's place as the new Black Panther. Meanwhile, a mysterious figure called Killmonger is attempting to infiltrate Wakanda and reveal dark secrets of the Black Panther's ancestors. And the story for Black Panther 2 is that after the very touching scene where T'Challa dies and we have the funeral where Wakanda are oddly both happily dancing around and sad, we then cut to 1 year later. Marvel just love skipping ahead of the story of grief, don't they? Anyway, Shuri is still mourning the loss of her brother, and her family have to continue and fulfill the promises that T'Challa gave to the American government. Suddenly a new character named Namor has surfaced and threatens to wage war against Wakanda and the rest of humanity. Now, the first thing I liked about Wakanda Forever was the commentary that the American government want to come in and take Wakanda's resources to make bigger weapons for their own selfish and corrupt gains. And you really hear the nerve in their voices, like they are owed Wakanda's technology when really,
I got news for you, pal. You ain't leading but two things right now. Jack and shit. And Jack left town.
And then we find out that they were the ones who sent these mercenaries to steal from the Wakandans. And that scene was great. I wouldn't be surprised if in a future Black Panther movie the American government would try to villainize the Wakandans just so they can try to justify starting a war and stealing Wakanda's resources by force. That matches the inner workings of real-life wars as we have learned throughout American history, and it would make for a great story. So including that commentary in the movie was incredibly smart, and I am very glad that they did that. And the first Black Panther very much follows the Shakespearean story of Hamlet, where someone tries to take the throne from our main character, and our character has to take the throne back. There have been countless adaptations of the Hamlet storyline in movies throughout the years, and I really liked this version. You have a great hero and a great villain with really interesting side characters, and the story of betrayal within the family was executed very well and was even emotional. For the villain, that is. Now, Black Panther 2 is getting praised and criticized for its slower pace, and I personally like that Marvel did a slower paced movie that didn't suck. But I feel like there have already been slower comic book movies out there that have made a much bigger impact and were far more effective with their pace than Wakanda Forever was. All three of these movies had to deal with grief and were paced slower, and this movie tries to let some of its emotional scenes unfold slower, but it was just decent with the way it handled its slower pace and grieving tone. And of course, you still have those MCU jokes which weren't in here as much, thank God, but you could definitely notice them when they happened. And although this movie handled grief well, it didn't emotionally resonate with me as much as it could, and I wanted it to have had. The opening scene with T'Challa's death was surprisingly emotional, but that's where the emotions peaked for me. The later scenes didn't really get me choked up at all. Also, the new character this movie introduces, called Riri Williams, was just a plot device, and you could have completely taken out of the story and it would have made no difference to the plot whatsoever. And she actually made the movie significantly longer than it needed to be, and that did go against the otherwise good pacing. Now, the first movie accomplishes exactly what it sets out to do with its story of betrayal and family heresy, and the pacing could be slow at times to some, but I thought the movie was well paced and I was pretty much always engaged with what was happening. The only time it failed at its tone was the dumb MCU jokes, which I feel were far worse than the jokes in Wakanda Forever. That being said, however, the first movie is 2 hours and 15 minutes, whereas the second movie is 2 hours and 41 minutes, and I don't think it's saying much more than the first movie did to justify that runtime. And the story overall just doesn't feel as tight and focused, and I really do think that cutting Riri Williams out of the movie would have brought the runtime down just the right amount. So I like the story in the second movie, but it feels like it's longer than it needed to be, and the intrigue was not as well spread out throughout the story. The first movie, however, maintained a good pace and didn't feel like it was padding the story out with any unneeded plot devices or setups for future movies. So I like the stories for both films, but the movie with the all-round superior story with regards to writing, pacing, and execution is the first Black Panther. Now, Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa. He was honestly the least interesting character in the first Black Panther movie. Now, it was not his fault, because he was great in Civil War, where he was given a very captivating revenge story with a great conclusion to his arc. But in his own movie, every other character was far more interesting than he was. That being said though, in Black Panther 2, his absence was really felt. They pay a nice tribute to him in the opening of the movie, and they constantly acknowledge him, which definitely helps, but it's not the same as actually having him. And although I liked the tribute they did to Chadwick Boseman, the actor, I didn't think it was good for the character of T'Challa, and I think it was a big missed opportunity for them to not have him killed off by either Namor or an outside threat like Kang or Doctor Doom, which would be a great way of making us and the whole MCU have it out for them. So in my opinion, even though it felt like a nice tribute to the actor, I don't think the tribute was that effective that it needed to make the character's death feel that inconsequential to the rest of the story going forward. And I feel like that was a disservice to the character of T'Challa, but at the same time, I get what troubles they were under, so it's a hard tightrope to walk. But I think they could have done a better job at killing off the character whilst also respecting the actor. Because like I said, I personally didn't really get the feels when they were trying to get us emotional about him. Now on the plus side, the side characters for Black Panther were always interesting to me, so I was glad to see them again, and seeing them have to come to grips with losing their king, and this was great to watch. It rarely ever happens, but it was nice to see an MCU movie where the drama and the characters were the center stage, and not them quipping or making jokes. And Shuri of all people, I thought they handled her story very well, and it didn't come off as the fake female empowerment kind of story like what happened with Captain Marvel and She-Hulk. This movie was left with a very hard situation, that being the real life death of their main character, and to replace that person with a side character, it's no easy task. And I thought they did a really good job of giving her an arc and making it difficult for her to take up the mantle of the Black Panther, and to even give her her own revenge story like what T'Challa had in Civil War. So I liked that, as well as the story points for the rest of the characters. And then we have Riri Williams, and her inclusion was so obviously just here to set her up for her future Disney Plus series. And she also made the movie feel like a cartoon from beginning all the way into the end when she got into her new Power Rangers suit. Do you remember when I said that they didn't do the fake female empowerment thing with Shuri? Well, that's exactly what they did with Riri. In the first Iron Man, Stark made that prototype suit that couldn't fly that high and broke down. And this is adult Tony Stark. But 19-year-old Riri here made a suit that could fly so high into the hemisphere, and her suit didn't malfunction or freeze up or anything. I can buy that a mutant man lives underwater. I can even sort of buy the wings in his ankles, as funny as they are. I cannot buy that a 19-year-old can build a fully functioning Iron Man suit that fires energy beams and can fly over the hemisphere. And the movie gets even dumber. She's never had combat training, so what is she doing in this big final war-like battle? She brought this movie down from being a heavier drama to feeling like a generic MCU kids film. And what really hurts about this is that she takes away screen time from other characters that barely got any. You might have realized that when I was talking about the characters, I did not once mention M'Baku, and that's because he is barely in Wakanda Forever. And that is very bad when you take into account that he actually had a complicated relationship with T'Challa. Just think about it. T'Challa is someone who he looked at as a rival, someone he wanted to overthrow, someone he thought should not have taken the throne, but that he should have instead. And he challenges him for it and loses. And yet, in spite of that, he clearly had respect for him and even heals him and then accepts him as his king. But I always thought that if you asked him if he was happy about it, M'Baku would still have some reluctance inside of him and some ill feelings towards T'Challa, as he was never fully on board with him being his king. So to see how he reacts once he finds that T'Challa is dead and now he could take the throne like he always wanted, it would have been so interesting to see how this would have mentally affected his character, now that the obstacle that was blocking his path is gone, but not in the way he would have liked. This movie just as much could have been a great character study of M'Baku as it was for Shuri, and him eventually choosing to protect T'Challa's younger sister as a dying promise to his king. But none of that was delved into with any kind of depth because he didn't get nearly enough screen time, and again, that's most likely because they had to make room for Riri, and her inclusion really does stab the movie from every angle. She affects the story, she affects the pacing, she affects the characters, the action, and even the villain, which we will talk more about later. In the first movie, every character had a purpose and their motivations were very clear and tightly written, but Wakanda Forever feels flimsy, and it's understandable as it was a big undertaking to make a movie around side characters and to do it so quickly to meet both Disney and Marvel's deadlines. But the movie we have is the movie we have, and when compared to the characters in the first Black Panther, they just didn't feel as interesting and fleshed out to me, which I did enjoy. But T'Challa's Luke Skywalker arc, where he doesn't listen to the lessons of his predecessors and does things his way, was much more captivating to me than the similar realization that Shuri gets regarding her mother. And all of these things just makes the characters and their developments feel more uneven in Black Panther 2, whereas I feel like everyone had the perfect amount of development time in the first movie. And that's not even counting the fact that we have Chadwick Boseman as Black Panther, but once you do count him, that undeniably makes the movie with the superior characters the first Black Panther. Now, I have already mentioned that I wasn't a fan of the action in the first Black Panther. I thought it was very amateur in its execution, was incredibly basic, had very unimpressive CGI, unfinished CGI, and it was just very boring to sit through. And the way it wouldn't even try to hide its PG-13 rating was laughable at times.
No blood.
The car chase scene was by far the best action scene in the entire movie, even though the CGI was really quite terrible at times here too. I also thought that the challenge scenes were pretty decent too and harkened back to Ryan Coogler's Creed movie, but every other action scene was a complete disappointment to me, and was done much better in Infinity War. Now in Black Panther 2, we had our first proper action scene at around the 40-minute mark, and it was a car chase scene. And this car chase was so bad that I actually got scared for a second. It lacked any of the creativity that the car chase in the first Black Panther had, it didn't have anywhere near the variety, and it just felt incredibly basic. On the plus side, you actually had practical car crashes, which is new for Phase 4 of the MCU, but then it ended with a CGI jellyfish car crash. So the car chase felt like a huge downgrade to me, and that got me concerned for the rest of the action. However, I am glad to say that the rest of the action was a lot better and a much needed improvement over the action in the first movie. It felt like a lot more was going on, and they actually had time to choreograph the action a lot more. Now that being said, the action was still not great. It's not the kind of action that you'd rush to watch again, as again, it's really quite basic and even very PG-13 friendly. And there are no slightly more violent moments, such as the little blood that we saw in the first movie, or the extreme PG-13 violence that we recently saw in Black Adam. And that is a shame, as there were times where people were stabbing each other with spears or swiping each other with swords, and it all felt weightless. There was a point when Namor punches M'Baku so hard that his armor breaks into pieces, and the impact happens in slow-mo like he got hurt very badly. But then he just brushes the punch off like it was nothing. Also, Namor's people cannot be killed with simple stab wounds or broken bones, as they seem to get right back up and heal themselves. But did Wakanda think about cutting their heads off? It's something that is perfectly doable with a PG-13 rating. We have seen it happen in The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and even in Fox's PG-13 X-Men movies. The reason that kind of thing is not even attempted here, even though it could, is because the limitations of the MCU are taking the possibilities away. But none of this seems to matter, because later the Wakandans just fight them and they go down like normal enemies. So the action in Wakanda Forever was overall better than the first movie, but it was still lacking. So this just confirms that director Ryan Coogler's strongest quality as a director is not action. And this really worries me, because it's being rumored that he will direct Avengers Secret Wars, which is all about action. And I think he's really not the best talent for the job. But as for the action in both of these movies, they have their strong points, but they also have a lot of weak points too. But the car chase aside, I can easily say without a shadow of a doubt that the movie with the superior action is Black Panther 2. Now Namor has an interesting introduction. I like that it was trying to be a horror scene, but I thought it was too underplayed and diluted. I don't know if Marvel had a hand in this, but I think a more experienced horror director would have made the scene much more horrific. I mean, I liked the setup, but it just felt quite downplayed in terms of horror, atmosphere, and even the PG-13 rating. And I don't think his introduction is as intimidating as the movie thinks it is, and it didn't have the same impact and badassery that Killmonger had. And Killmonger didn't use a single explosion. Now that being said, Namor as a character felt like he was a lot more collected and calm, whereas Killmonger was acting calm, but was really bottling up his rage and then eventually let it all out once he reveals who he is to Wakanda. So they are both slightly different in that respect. And I like how Namor sees that society is full of people who steal resources from others, and he wants to defend his people from that potential threat. Again, I thought that was very smart commentary to include, and I was very glad that they did. One thing I thought though is that with Killmonger, you understood what drove him to war. The movie did a great job of showing you his emotional state and where his ideals came from, and how his personal anger and grief drove him to war. But Namor is a more collected villain, someone who thinks more rationally, and for a character that is very put together and has his emotions in check, I thought he chose the war path very quickly, and I'm like, this makes no sense. You've been given a backstory of sorts, but I don't think it justifies going to war this quickly. That should be a last resort. And why are you involving the Wakandans? They are very much victims in their own way, so if you want to start a war, start it. But leave the Wakandans out of it. But he very much wanted an alliance with them and essentially said, you're either with us or against us. There is no in between. Which honestly, in my book, just made him a dick. And that's where I thought his motivation felt shaky and the problem started to come in. I mean, sure, he gives him a method of peacefully resolving solving this issue? And his answer is no. It felt like he just wanted a war because he's a bit of an asshole and used his backstory as an excuse. Killmonger had similar ingredients, but his reason for wanting to start a war felt like an organic direction for his character to go, as crazy and bloodthirsty as he was. That's not the case for Namor, and the main reason why Namor wants to start a war is because of Riri Williams. I really think that this needed just one more rewrite and then it would have been perfect, but as is, most likely due to deadlines, Namor's motivation was good, but it did feel underwritten. Also with Killmonger, there was mystery and there was intrigue surrounding him. Who is this guy? And how does he seem to know so much about Wakanda? And what is he up to? Namor, on the other hand, doesn't have any mystery about him, and although his story started out making sense, the more it went on, it felt like the writing started to get quite loose and inconsistent. And in addition to that, it felt like he was too underplayed and didn't leave as strong an impact as other villains with this war complex, such as both versions of Magneto did, or Thanos did, or even Killmonger did. He just didn't come across as the intimidating mastermind those other Marvel villains did. There was also this right-hand woman that Namor had who kept pushing him to take the violent approach, and I honestly thought that she was so freaking forgettable that if she died, I wouldn't even really know what it meant to Namor. Whereas Killmonger's girlfriend, who had next to no screen time in the first movie and next to no lines, was much more memorable, and you know how much it hurt Killmonger to kill her, but he did it anyway. That level of depth is not there with Namor and his hench people. Killmonger, in all honesty, is just a much more tightly written villain, and although they tried to give Namor a reason for his tyranny, it just didn't work as well in the end, and the reason felt kind of half-baked and not fully thought out, especially when compared to Killmonger. So Namor is definitely a decent villain, but the movie with a superior villain is the first Black Panther. Now, for all the praise I'm giving it, the first Black Panther had its own fair share of problems as well. The CGI was terrible, the green screen was on par with movies from the early 2000s, the action scenes were inexcusably underwhelming, and there was no rewatch value. You hope to appreciate the action scenes or catch details on your second viewing that you never noticed the first time round. And despite watching this movie for the second and even third time, I got nothing new out of it. If anything, the flaws just became more apparent to me, especially with the action. And as for Wakanda Forever, it was decent. The movie isn't groundbreaking in any new way, it's playing in the same sandbox that the MCU has already been playing in for many years. It doesn't push the bar any further with regards to its tone or even its violence. If anything, the violence is pulled back, and even tonally I would say that the movie feels quite mundane. The underwater world just felt like another generic and uninspired CGI world that we have seen countless times from the MCU. It was also incredibly small. I mean, seriously, this is your underwater kingdom.
It's small, isn't it?
I appreciate that this movie focused on grief a lot more, but at its core, this still felt like an MCU movie, right down to the increasingly forced setups for future projects, even at the expense of the current movie's story. And then you also get the conveniences that Disney have just been full of lately. Shuri gets stabbed really badly, and she's perfectly fine. What is up with Disney and their characters surviving fatal stab wounds lately? First Iron Man, then twice in Obi-Wan, then there was Thanos, the first Black Panther, Thor Love and Thunder, and now Shuri. I will say this in Wakanda Forever's defense. On paper, I love this movie. Aside from the problems I mentioned earlier, I think it is a very well written script. In execution though, it needed to be much more. It needed to be more with the tone, it needed to be more with the action, and it did need to tighten up the writing for Namor, as well as make him darker to truly have him leave a strong impact. But his impact didn't really compare to what came before. This movie is better than the rest of the Phase 4 MCU movies, but one of the things it has in common is that I left feeling empty. Imagine leaving a 2-hour and 45-minute movie and feeling empty. And even though the first Black Panther lacks rewatch value, I can see myself watching the movie again, and I have. But with Wakanda Forever, I've seen it once, and I really don't care to see it again, much like the rest of Phase 4. It's time for the scores. The first Black Panther gets a high 7 out of 10, and Wakanda Forever, I was going to give it a regular 7 out of 10, but the more I thought about it, my score went down to a high 6 out of 10. Wakanda Forever to me was decent. It wasn't good, it was just decent. It is better than all of the MCU movies in Phase 4, but at the same time, that really isn't saying much. The movie was longer than it needed to be, and single-handedly, Riri Williams came in and, well, This is an example of Marvel trying to forcefully set up a new character for their cinematic universe, and it compromised every aspect of this movie. This does not give me confidence for her own Disney Plus show. I really hope they come back to T'Challa's death and say that it was Kang or Doctor Doom that was responsible for his sickness, so it feels like Black Panther died contributing to the next phase, even though he's not going to be in it. His death and presence will hover over the entire phase, and it would give us a big reason to hate the next villain. Regardless, I applaud their attempt at making Wakanda Forever, as it could have been so much worse. So I definitely do appreciate the movie for that. And if you enjoyed it, then that's great, it really is. But for me, it just didn't quite win me over like the first movie did. Thanks very much for watching, guys, and I would like to give a huge thank you to all of my patrons. Your support really does mean a lot to me. For those of you that don't know, I've recently published trailer reactions to the new Super Mario Bros. Trailer, Indiana Jones 5, and John Wick Chapter 4. And all you have to do is donate just $1 to gain access to them, as well as my previous and future trailer reactions. Thank you so much as always for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it. Happy holidays to you all. I hope you had a fantastic Christmas, and I will see all of you very soon. Take care.